Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here to talk to you guys about a lot of the various bedside guns that I've had over the years. And before I get into that, I'm going to talk about a lot of cool things that a lot of people will be interested in, especially pistol caliber carbines and things like that. I did want to take a moment to say that I recognize that the situation that I have been in for most of my life as a gun owner has not been the typical situation for a lot of other people, and because of that, my choice for a bedside gun is probably not going to be the same as yours, and probably shouldn't be the same as yours. And the situations are just generally different. Up until recently, I've done a lot of traveling for my work, and so guns that travel well tend to be more what I'm interested in, more what I have to consider. A lot of people don't travel nearly as much as I do. I travel about 200 nights a year. That's how often I'm away from home a lot of times. Most people aren't in that situation, and so what works well for them for a bedside gun is not going to be what works well for me for a bedside gun. So yes, I'm talking about this in terms of my bedside guns. That is guns that I would keep at my bedside to defend my domicile from, potential burglars and other things that might go on. What works well for me is not obviously going to work well for everyone. And a lot of people who watch this video may be new gun owners who wound up buying guns because of everything that's going on with COVID-19, the coronavirus, and all that stuff that's going on. The coronavirus has really upset the nation and upset a lot of nations in a lot of ways. Some of what's going on is just good common sense for dealing with a very infectious disease. Other parts of what's going on, though, is just the result of sheer panic, and that's not so good. And that's something that is it has produced a lot of negative effects. One of them is that the economy has pretty much tanked because a lot of production that used to happen is just not happening anymore. And so the economy is taking a bit of a nosedive, and when the economy goes down, there's a lot of ripple effects that goes out, and I was actually one of the people that was affected by those ripple effects. I am laid off officially as of today, so I am not working at the moment. I am unemployed right now. Hopefully it's going to be a temporary layoff, I hope. But sometimes economies just don't come back like they were originally, and things can just be really problematic if depending on how things go. But hoping that things get better, and taking the meantime to make some gun videos. So there's that. But a lot of crazy things happen, and like I said, economic downturn is one crazy thing that happens, but another crazy thing that happens in panic situations is that crime tends to go up. People get desperate. They don't necessarily have the necessities or as many of them as they think they would like, and desperate people tend to do desperate things, and so crime rate goes up. And as the crime rate goes up, the ability of the infrastructure that we have in place to deal with said crime tends to go down. And what that means is that there are going to be more and more people that are going to be stuck defending themselves. And I, as a gun owner, would say that that really should be people's mentality in the first place, that you should recognize that you can't always depend on other people to save your bacon all the time. You should just realize that that's a reality of life. But there's a lot of people that are learning that because of this recent coronavirus issue. For example, the city of Philadelphia, the city hall released a statement saying that their police would no longer be pursuing suspects of relatively minor crimes including things like burglary and also car theft. There are other things on the list, but those are two very major ones that stand out because those are crimes that can be particularly violent. If a burglary occurs while people are in the home, that's a very dangerous situation, and it's one that can result in great harm or death. And in the case of theft of auto, if someone performs a carjacking, especially with people still in the car, they're often going to do it with a dangerous implement of some kind, whether it be a gun or a knife or something that can present a real deadly threat to the people that are involved. And in Philadelphia, they basically said that we're not going to be pursuing those criminals. And so it's left a lot of people feeling really helpless who, to a certain extent, used to kind of trust the police to take care of their security for them. And they're realizing that the police, might not show up at all. And if they do show up, it'll just basically to be take statements and say, well, it sucks to be you, and go about their day. And I'm not saying that necessarily to demean police officers. There are some police officers that I wouldn't trust any further than I could throw them. But there's a number of police officers that really do believe that they're to protect and serve, but they can only do so much at a time. And in situations where panic craziness goes up, like we're dealing with now, you're not going to be able to get to everything. It's just the reality of the situation, and so people are left fending for themselves. And what would work best for a lot of those people, like I said, is not going to be what works best for me. I travel a lot, and that really drives my gun purchase decisions. A lot of people are going to be better served with something that might be considered more typical. For example, and by the way, all the guns I'm going to show you guys have already been checked and cleared off screen, so don't worry about that. But something that would be a little bit more typical than what I'm going to show you would be something like this AR-15. This one is made by Delton, and it is an Echo 316H model, but it's a basic AR-15. Now, for home defense, I wouldn't recommend putting this kind of an optic on it. When you have a scope like this is better set up for distance work, not for close quarters of being in a house or in an apartment or something like that. This would be better suited for target practice at the range or hunting or something like that. This is not a gun that I personally use for home defense. This is a range gun, and that's why it's set up with a range optic. If I was using it for home defense, I would probably have a red dot on there with a flashlight, or I'd have a flashlight with some open sights on it, something like that. But for a lot of people, they would be better served with something like this than some of the guns that I'm going to show you. And that's because you can get into these guns relatively cheaply, or at least before all the panic buying of the coronavirus stuff happened. Now the prices are starting to go up. But you used to be able to get into a used AR-15 for under $600 pretty easily, and a lot of times under $400 and occasionally even $300. And these guns are great because they're relatively simple to use, and a lot of the basic models that are out there are kind of heavy. This one without the scope on it weighs something like 7 pounds or something like that, which is kind of heavy, but the nicety of the extra weight is that it absorbs a lot of the recoil and makes it a lot more pleasant to shoot. And it makes it so that you can keep it on target a lot easier. You can hold a decent group with it fairly easily. The controls on it are not difficult to use at all. And in terms of firepower, it holds quite a few rounds. This is an empty magazine, by the way, of course. Like I said, all these are checked and cleared off screen. But a lot of times these things will sell with 20 or 30 round magazines. This one's a 30 round magazine. And each round has usually around 1,000 to 1,200 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at the muzzle, and you have 30 of those in the gun. For people who are worried about something happening to them in the night, or when they're general at home or something like that, something like this is going to give them a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to deal with that situation. Another good option that is out there would be a pump shotgun. Pump shotguns don't usually hold nearly as many rounds, usually 5 to 7 for a typical pump shotgun, but the rounds themselves are very powerful rounds. You talk about like a 3-inch 12-gauge Magnum slug, and that can deliver like 3,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. That's a really, really powerful round. If it connects with anything, it's going to be pretty much the end of the story right then and there. It's going to take care of the problem very quickly. Now, personally, I don't like shotguns for self-defense and used by the bedside for a number of reasons. But the reasons that would be most applicable to the average person is the simple fact that shotguns, especially on the cheaper end of things, are usually fairly light. That's how they make them cheaper. They use polymers and stuff like that, which is a fancy word for plastic. But they'll be made out of relatively inexpensive light materials. And the consequence of that, of lightening the gun up, is that there's going to be more felt recoil. A gun that is proportionally heavier with a smaller cartridge is going to have less felt recoil. A gun that is lighter with a more powerful cartridge is going to have a lot more felt recoil, and that's usually where a lot of the cheaper shotguns are. So they're unpleasant to shoot, and then on top of that, a lot of people who are new to guns, who aren't very familiar with guns, actually have a lot of trouble operating a pump shotgun. For a pump shotgun to work, you have to rack a new round into the chamber each time you need to fire a new round. And racking a round into the chamber can be difficult if you don't know how to do it, and if you haven't done it a lot. This doesn't mean it's completely outside the scope of what a new shooter can do, certainly not, but there are a number of cases that I've seen incidentally. Not that I've ever been in a life or death situation, nor do I ever want to be, but there are a number of cases where I have seen people working shotguns at the range who short stroke the action of that pump and wound up creating a jam. And that's without any great stress in the situation. This isn't fighting for your life. This is just general at the range. I'm a new shooter, don't really know what I'm doing yet, and not familiar enough with the action to know how hard you have to rack that thing in order to get it to run right every time. And if you have someone who's brand new to firearms, who doesn't have a lot of experience on a pump shotgun, using it for the first time in a defensive encounter, not so great. My recommendation with all guns, shotguns included, but especially shotguns, is to get some practice rounds, some dummy rounds. A lot of times they're called snap caps or something like that. And compared to the cost of a gun, they're relatively cheap. It's usually no more than $15, $20 at the outside for a package of snap caps. And what they are is they're little, they look like cartridges, except they're completely inert. They don't have any gunpowder in them at all. There is no bullet. It's basically just a shell of a cartridge. Sometimes it's plastic, sometimes it's aluminum, but it's basically a fake round. And they're really great for training purposes. You can practice loading the magazine with them. You can practice chambering around with them and racking the next one in. And with pump shotguns and any gun, it's good to be in that practice and to practice regularly, to load some dummy rounds into the gun and go through practicing with them. And the nice thing about practice rounds is that you can dry fire them. You can pull the trigger on them and it's not going to damage anything or damage the gun. They're really useful things, and if you are a first-time gun owner, I would suggest two things. First of all, really, 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 really study gun safety. Like with any tool, hey, guns are not automatically going to kill people, but people who don't know what they're doing with a dangerous tool, that's where the danger lies. Think about it like with sharp knives. Is a sharp knife that's sitting in the kitchen drawer at home automatically going to jump out of the drawer and start killing people in the neighborhood? No, that's pretty ridiculous. It's not going to do something on its own. But if you have someone who doesn't know what they're doing handling a sharp knife and trying to help out in the kitchen, there's a really good chance that somebody could be missing a finger by the end of the session. You want to make sure that you actually teach people how to hold a knife properly, which direction that you cut, like cutting away from you, things like that. Those good general guidelines that if you follow them, you're going to be able to get done whatever you need to get done, but without any injury. The same thing applies to guns. Guns are a tool, and they are a tool that has the potential to be very dangerous, and because of that, you need to study how to use them safely. So in the description box in this video, I'm going to post a link to a safety video that I did. It's particularly on handguns, but the basic safety rules that I cover are applicable to all firearms. Okay, and so I'm going to post a link down in the description for you guys to take a look at who are new. Go over there and learn how to safely use your firearms. And then my other general recommendation, like I've already said, get some snap caps and practice with them. Now when you're using the snap caps, don't have any live ammunition anywhere around. Like in this situation right here, I have completely unloaded guns, and all the ammunition that's actually loaded into magazines for these guns is in the other room. This room right here does not have any live ammunition that is going to be fed into these guns at all. Completely safe environment. And when you guys practice with your snap caps, that's what you need to do. Take the real ammunition, put it somewhere else, make sure that all the guns are checked and cleared before you mess with them, then you get out the snap caps and start cycling the action, seeing how the gun works, dry firing, practicing all those kinds of things. And I would recommend that you do that once a week or so. Sorry about that. I get a lot of spam phone calls here. As much fun as that is, where's this one from? Detroit. lots of people that I know in Detroit, let me tell you. I don't know anyone in Detroit, but, you know. So fun. Do you guys get random calls like that too? It's annoying. But yeah, guns like this, AR-15 or a pump shotgun or something like that, is going to be a lot better for a lot of people, especially these days, because you can get into them relatively cheaply, especially the used ones, and they're fairly powerful. And another thing about these larger guns is that you can, of course, shoulder fire them. And when you shoulder fire a weapon, you're much more likely to hit what you're aiming at. Handguns tend to be a little mitt or hiss. A lot of people who like handguns are not nearly as accurate with handguns as they would really like to be, or sometimes as accurate as they are in their own head. I'm in that category too. Practically, if you actually want to be sure that you're going to get shots on target, a long gun of some kind is usually better. And you might as well get something that's fairly powerful, you know, if you don't have a lot of travel concerns and those kinds of things. So AR-15 is great. A lot of pump guns are great. With all of them, you need to practice running the action, get some W rounds, go through, practice the drills, make sure you learn firearm safety. There'll be a link down in the description. But all of that basically just to say that your situation and my situation are not going to be exactly the same. So with that said, I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about the bedside guns that I've used. The very first gun that I ever bought for myself was this one right here. This is a Smith & Wesson M&P 1522. It looks a lot like the AR-15 that I was just handling, but it's not. The chambering is different. This fires 22 LR rounds, and 22 LR stands for .22 caliber. LR is long rifle, so a 22 caliber long rifle. And it's a very common cartridge that is out there, and a very inexpensive cartridge that is out there. And when I first got this gun, I was not thinking of a defensive gun at all. I was thinking of something that I could go out and shoot with my family. My family has been a gun family for years and owned different guns at different times throughout the years, but there's often a gun around in the household. You know, I was raised around guns, taught how to use them, how to handle them properly and appropriately, etc., etc. And so I didn't really have any concerns about those kinds of things. But for a large part of my adult life, I just really wasn't interested in owning one for myself. Growing up, we had generally been exposed to handguns. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people are not nearly as accurate with handguns as they would like to be, and sometimes not as accurate as they think they are. And like I said, I definitely fall in that category. I'm not overly great with handguns even now. I've definitely gotten better. But to begin with, I was absolutely awful with handguns. There was one point in my life where I was responsible for a .22 Magnum revolver. It was not technically mine. It was belonged to my folks technically, but I was responsible for it, and I was the one who would shoot it and those kinds of things. And I kind of hit the broadside of a barn with that thing. And I don't think it was because the gun was inaccurate or anything like that. I just sucked at shooting handguns. And because of that, because my experience was primarily with handguns and not being able to hit anything, I just didn't really have a whole lot of interest in guns. Now, as time went on and the political atmosphere started to change, and also as I became more aware of exactly what was going on politically, I said, this is something that I do definitely need to take a stand on, and I also would like to be able to enjoy myself when I go out shooting with my family, and I'd like to be able to actually hit the target. So I thought, hey, I can kill two birds with one stone. I can make a political statement of saying I am on this side of the fence by actually purchasing a firearm, and I can fulfill the basic role that I wanted to of having a gun to go out and plink with my family that isn't going to break the bank, shoots a very inexpensive round, and the gun itself is fairly inexpensive. And it's a gun that I'm actually going to be able to hit with because it's something that I can actually shoulder and I can get a very accurate shot off. Now, I'm not super great with long guns, but I'm a whole lot better with long guns than handguns, and most people are. And so this did great at that. Like I said, I wasn't thinking self-defense. I was thinking this is a political statement. Okay, if you are a gun owner, you are political. And if you're not a gun owner, you are political as well. It's just the reality of the situation in which we live now. almost everything is politics one way or another. And everything has to do with your life philosophy. Everything has to do with what is good and what is best. Morality is everywhere now. Well, it's always been everywhere. It's just that a lot of people tend to be a lot more aware of it now than they used to be, just because the more differences in standards of morality are becoming so much wider than they used to be. That is getting to become quite a bit of an issue. But this was the gun that I got for that. I'm saying I'm a part of this camp. I believe that citizens should be allowed to own guns for their own self-defense, and government isn't always going to be able to be there to bail you out. I think I've mentioned already the situation that happened in Philadelphia where government officials, maybe that was in a different take, but anyways, if I didn't mention it, in Philadelphia, the City Hall announced that they're not going to be addressing lesser crimes, things like auto theft and burglary. I think I already mentioned this. But what it's left people realizing is that, the government isn't always going to be able to come and save them, even if the government officials are good and they do want to come and save you. The reality of the situation is that sometimes they're just not going to be able to. And so I'm definitely for people having the ability to defend themselves. I'm also for them taking the time to learn how to use them correctly and safely, and that's why I'm going to put a link to the safety video that I did a while ago in the description box on this video so that you guys can reference that if you're new to gun owners, if you're new gun owners. But yeah, definitely makes a statement about where I am and what my morality is. And then on top of that, I could go out and plink with the family when they wanted to go out and have a range day, and I could actually hit the target, and I could do it without breaking the bank, and that was pretty awesome. Now, at the time that I got this, I lived in a part of town that isn't great, and the part of town that I live in right now is actually kind of the same part of town, different building, but more or less the same part of town. It's not overly great, and there would be times that I would set this thing loaded next to my bedside just because I was a little nervous. Not that I really thought anything too major was going to happen, but one of those better safe than sorry kind of things. And then at the time, I was also still getting used to my new job. At the time, my new job was working as a dealer rep for a metal building company, and I would gallivant across the country going and talking to our dealers, these people that would sell the metal buildings for us. And that's what I did. I was go and talk to them, put out brush fire here or there, take care of the issues as they rose as best I could. And when you travel across the country in a vehicle, you stay in a lot of hotels, and my company budget is pretty decent, but not always awesome, and sometimes you wind up staying in hotels that are not exactly in the best part of town, and you start getting a little bit nervous. And so at that time I started thinking, it might be a good idea to have a gun around that maybe has a little bit more defensive capability than a 22. 22s can kill, and last time I checked, about 10% of self-defensive use of a gun involved 22s of one form or another. And so they definitely do get used. A lot of people think that 22s are used in more defensive encounters than any other gun in the world, and that's not true. Like I said, at most it's about 10%. Not the majority by far. But it can be used, but still don't feel very confident with it. And at the time, I really wasn't considering traveling with the gun itself, but more so it was the issue of just being exposed to greater amounts of danger, or at least greater amounts of perceived danger. And so my reaction was, well, you know what, at the time I didn't really feel comfortable traveling with guns because, frankly, part of it was I didn't know all the restrictions and all the legalities and whatnot. But I still wanted something that was a little bit harder hitting than a 22. But I also realized my situation in that most of the time when I shoot, it's not defensively. In fact, it's never been defensively so far, and I hope to keep it that way. But most of the time, it's recreational. I go out to shoot to have fun, to go out and blink and, shoot at some paper targets. And try to see if I can hit the bullseye. That's about the extent of what I do. So I didn't want something that was overly expensive because I wanted to be able to go out and do that without breaking the bank. but something that was better in the defensive role than a 22. And so what I came up with was going to 9mm. At the time, I still wanted to have something that I was confident about hitting the target with. And so I wound up with this beast right here. This is an IWI Tavor X95 chambered in 9mm. Uses these double stack stick magazines that feed into the back part of the gun instead of in front of the trigger assembly. Most guns have the magazine in front of the trigger assembly. That's the normal position for them. This is a bullpup, and what that means is that the magazine is going to feed behind the trigger and handle assembly. And what that allows you to do is it really scrunches up the gun. Just putting this in comparison here, here's an AR-15 with about a 16-inch barrel on it, and I can't even fit it in frame here. They're both resting on my knees. My Tavor has a 16-inch barrel, but you can see that I can fit it in frame. It is considerably shorter. Now, in terms of weight, they're not that different. My AR, as it's configured right now, is about a 9-pound gun. This Tavor is also about a 9-pound gun. Where is it? I have it written down here somewhere. It is 8 pounds 10 ounces, so a little under 9 pounds, as it is currently configured. And that does include the weights of the magazine. Not that that's a lot. It's an empty magazine, of course. But that is it. So it's a little bit more potent round, 9mm. It's usually thought of as a handgun cartridge. It's not an overly powerful round, but it is relatively cheap to shoot. And that was one of my major concerns. I was also under the impression at the time that handgun cartridges wouldn't penetrate as much as rifle cartridges, and it turns out that that is not always true. If you're talking about a hollow point that actually hits the intended targets, the bad guy as it were, then yeah, handgun rounds will oftentimes stop pretty well in the intended target and not go through it if you have a hollow point that is designed to do that. For example, gold dots have a pretty good reputation for doing that. HST and has a pretty good reputation for doing that. Hydroshock has a pretty good reputation for doing that. Those are all rounds that will stop in the bad guy pretty well, and they're designed to. The problem, though, with handgun rounds is if you happen to miss, then the handgun round actually tends to penetrate a lot more than you think it would. If it goes through things like drywall that you're going to encounter in a lot of homes and a lot of apartments, that hollow point that in the bad guy would open up and basically stop the round from going too far, it doesn't open up in a lot of drier mediums like drywall. Instead, the round is going to stay closed, and it's just going to keep punching right on through. It's not going to put on the brakes and stop itself. And in that kind of situation, the rifle rounds, like from an AR-15, intermediate calibers like 5.56 by 45, which is what AR-15s usually shoot, or 5.45 by 39, which is what some of the AK-74 shoot. And no, I didn't get that wrong. There's a few different AK pattern guns out there. The most famous, of course, is the 47, but there's another one that came later on that was also pretty good called the 74, and it shoots a little different, and it shoots a bit different cartridge. The intermediate rifle cartridges actually do a better job of breaking up in dry substances than handgun rounds do. And so if you're worried about missing the targets and you don't want the round to go too far outside of the room that you're in, intermediate rifle calibers from rifles actually are pretty good. But at the time, I was under the impression that handgun rounds, because they're less powerful, will penetrate less, and that's true in certain mediums, but not in all. But the big advantage was that 9mm, at least at the time, with all the coronavirus pandemic stuff, this has changed, but at the time, it was a lot cheaper to shoot 30 rounds through this than it was through my AR-15. A lot of times it was, about half the cost. And that's really good. So I could still shoot relatively cheaply, but it's a round that would be better, not perfect, but better at home defense than my little 22. Now there were definitely some trade-offs though. Like I said, this is an 8-pound 10-ounce gun, and so that is definitely an issue. And then the trigger on this gun is also heavier. Excuse me. Its trigger pull is about 5 pounds and 11.1 ounces when I measured it last. And that's pretty close to what the AR trigger pull is. Now, my little 22, on the other hand, its trigger pull comes in at 4 pounds 15 ounces. And so there's almost 3/4 of a pound difference in trigger pull between the two. So it's harder to pull the trigger on it. It's definitely heavier, but more powerful cartridge. And one of the things that I really liked about it is just how small it is. Like I said, I can fit the whole thing in frame. I can't do that with my AR-15. Really small, and through the time that I've been a gun owner, I've pretty much always lived in an apartment or backside room of one kind or another. Fairly small spaces, and so having something that could work in small spaces like this really appealed to me. And at the time, this was the best way that I knew of getting something that was small and still didn't have any significant legal issues. For those of you who don't know, in America, for something to be considered a rifle, which is going to be generally allowable for most people, it can change from state to state, but generally at the federal level, in order for something to be considered a rifle that you're not going to have any major issues with, it has to have a barrel that is at least 16 inches long and an overall length that is over 26 inches. This thing just barely meets those definitions. It's a little over 26 inches long. Let me see if I can find the length here. 26 inches and 3/8, at least according to my tape measure. 26 and 3/8 for the length of the gun itself. And the barrel, I think, is like 6.4, 6.5, sorry, 16.4 or 16.5 inch barrel, something like that, just a little over 16 inches. Meets the bare minimum legal requirements that it has to, and it's as small as it can be that way without having to get into any extra paperwork or tamp stacks or extra background checks. For every gun that you buy from a legal dealer, at least, you're going to have to do some kind of a background check. But if you want to get something that's smaller than this, a lot of times, depending on how you wanted it configured, something that could do the same things as this, it would actually have a true proper stock on it and a vertical grip on the forend. If you wanted to have something smaller than this that had those features, you have to fill out a special form that you send into the ATF. There's a $200 tax stamp that goes with it. There's a very long background check process and processing thing that happens that can take sometimes the better part of a year to go through. And of course, I didn't want to deal with that, and most people don't want to deal with that. So at the time, this was the option. A lot cheaper to shoot than an AR-15, and most of the time when I shoot, it's recreational. It's not for defensive purposes. And so having something that's cheap to shoot made sense, but could still, if need be better in the self-defense category than a 22. And I don't think that people would argue that. Is it as powerful as a true rifle round? Obviously not. It's just pistol caliber, but it was better. One problem with it, though, is that I very quickly discovered that it did not travel well. It's not a huge gun, but finding a suitcase that can hold this gun and finding a case that can go inside the suitcase that locks so that you can secure the gun, which is oftentimes required if you're going to travel, especially if you're going to travel by plane or something like that, well, that gets to be a bit of an issue. This is great around the apartments and things like that. It's fantastic around the apartment. Very small, lightweight, easy to use. Isn't going to break the bank if you want to go out and shoot it recreationally. Fantastic on all those regards, but it's still a little too big to travel well. Like I said, finding a case that could fit inside of a suitcase that was lockable so that I could actually take it on an airplane if I needed to was impossible. Were there suitcases out there that it could fit in? Yes. Were there dedicated gun cases that it could fit in? Yes. But a dedicated gun case that could fit inside the suitcase, which is what I needed, because I needed to minimize the amount of stuff that I carried with me, because, like I said, I was in hotels 200 nights a year. I was getting into and out of hotels all the time. I didn't want to pack a case for this and a pack a case for this, case for this. Everything I had, I wanted it to fit in one suitcase, because that's what was actually practical for what I was doing. If I had to pack in 30 things and have to pack out 30 things 200 times a year, that's going to get really freaking annoying. This didn't cut it. It's not a bad gun. I like it a lot. It's very reliable, as long as you care for it properly. There's actually been a couple of times I have had it malfunction. One time was when I put the wrong kind of oil in the gun. I put penetrating oil in the gun instead of lubricating oil in the gun. And penetrating oil penetrates and sort of loosen things up real well, but the problem is that after it dries out, it leaves behind a residue that gums everything up and it slows it down, and that's not going to run right. Well, no duh. Well, at the time I didn't realize what I was doing, and so that's one of the malfunctions I got. Other malfunction I got is when I was bench resting this thing, and these kinds of guns don't bench rest very well, but I was bench resting it and the magazine was resting on the table that I was shooting from, and that induced a malfunction, and a lot of guns that can happen with. The simple solution to that is use actual lubricating oil in the gun, and don't use the magazine as a bench rest tool, and that takes care of that. Other than that, it's been perfectly reliable, and it's also pretty accurate. It's not as accurate as a lot of hunting rifles, of course, but for my needs, it does just fine. A lot of times, even on a bad day, I can hold at least 8 MOA, which is obviously not good by rifle standards, but a lot of times you can get it to be sub 5 MOA if you try a little bit and you're using the right kind of ammo. On a real good day, sometimes you can get pretty close to 3 MOA, but that's pushing it. But for pistol caliber, that's not bad. That's pretty good, actually. So like the gun, still have the gun, and for around the apartments, I still use this one very frequently. It's a great gun. But it is definitely heavier, has a heavier trigger pull, and the size just not really quite travel friendly. So going on from there, I kind of went in the opposite direction. I'd gotten a gun that was heavier and had a heavier trigger pull, and great gun, just not very good for travel. And so I went kind of the other direction, and I got something that was super light. The gun itself is light, and it has a light trigger pull. This is the kel-tec CMR-30. And just to give you the quick stats on it, as soon as I can find it here, kel-tec CMR-30. The trigger pull weight on this thing is crazy light. It's 2 pounds, 8.1 ounces, so basically a 2.5 pound trigger pull. Really crazy light trigger pull. And then the overall weight of the gun is 4 pounds, 5 ounces by my scale. Like I said, I think my scale is registering kind of high numbers, but still under 4.5 pounds easily. And one of the great things about this thing is it has a telescoping stock on this thing. Just pull it out to extend it, and there's a little button up by my index finger that you push down on to collapse it. But with the stock collapsed and the vertical foregrip closed in, this became a much more manageable package. And when I had my old suitcase, which is a little bigger than the suitcase I currently have, there was actually a case I found that could hold this thing that would fit inside of my suitcase, so I could take everything together like I wanted to. And so for a while, this was my bedside gun, at least when I traveled. When I was at home, I would still use the X95 Tavor because it was a little bit harder hitting. But when I was out and about traveling, this thing actually fit in the case better. Had a stock that I could pull out so I could get more accurate shots. And this gun is not the wimpiest gun out there. It's not great, but it's not the wimpiest gun out there. It shoots 22 Magnum. Now you might remember that I said that this one shoots 22 LR, a long rifle, which is not a very powerful cartridge. 22 Magnum is definitely a step up. 22 Magnum out of a barrel of roughly this length is a little over 16 inches long for the barrel. But out of a barrel of this size, 22 Magnum will give you about the same power as a 9mm out of a handgun. So it's not great, but it's not terrible either. And they do make hollow points for these things, defensive hollow points for these things. Hornady makes some good ones. 45 grainers that work pretty well, and even the CCI Maxi Mags, which are also hollow points, actually work pretty well too. And in fact, most of the time when I would bring this thing around, I'd have it loaded with the CCI Maxi Mags. and this was the gun that I carried around for the longest time. Now, you'll notice that I have vertical foregrip, there's the handle, but there is no place to stick a magazine like in the other guns. Well, that's because this one has the magazine in the handle. This was a design that originally came from a pistol design, the CMR-30, that they converted into a full rifle form. And they kept the same pistol type magazine, and I didn't have any that were completely unloaded, and so I'm just bringing it out without the magazine in it. But the magazine for it holds 30 rounds, and it's actually a flush-fitting magazine. It sits basically flush with the bottom of that mag well. It doesn't stick out any further than that. It holds 30 rounds. So 30 rounds of something that is equivalent to a 9mm handgun that you can fire very accurately because you have that stock on there, that third point of contact, with a very light trigger. You can run this thing very fast and very accurate at range. I'm certainly not the most accurate gun shooter, and the red dot that it has on here is not really great for super precise work, but with just a little bit of attention, I can get this thing to be a 3 MOA shooter. And that's on the bad side of things. If you're a little bit more careful about your ammo that you use and the grain weight that you use, and you have maybe a better optic or maybe just a better eye than I do, hold a little bit, shake a little bit less than I do, I've seen people get this down to about 1.5 MOA. Very accurate little gun. Now, I've talked about this in a previous video where I talk about Nut & Fancy's appraisal of this thing, the CMR-30. And basically said that it is not as bad as a lot of people think that it is, because it's not, but it still has some drawbacks. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, go and see that video. It'll give you more details on it. But the short version of it is this. In order to get the gun to run right, you'll probably have to do some work to the magazine. Once you get the magazine working properly, though, it is a fun gun, and it is a blast to shoot. But never going to be 100% perfectly reliable. Once I got all the magazine issues figured out, it wound up being very, very, very reliable, but there were still issues that would occasionally creep up. For example, one of the guide rails that's internal to the gun wound up getting slightly bent at one point. Now, the gun frame here is aluminum, and aluminum is not the strongest metal on the face of the planet, and it can get bent. And it didn't actually keep the gun from running. It didn't actually cause the gun not to shoot when I wanted it to, but it did slow down the action a little bit because it was a little bit out of spec, and I could feel when I was shooting that the gun wasn't running as fast as it should, that the bolt wasn't coming back as fast as it should. And so that concerned me a little bit, and I eventually got it taken apart and figured out what the issue was and filed the rail back into place like it needed to be. And like I said, it never caused the gun to actually not work, but just the fact that the quality of the gun wasn't super high made me think, well, you know, this gun definitely fits the travel gun motif. You know, it gives me that third point of contact that I like because I'm not a great handgun shooter. It's not the most powerful gun in the world, but it's powerful enough. Like I said, it's equivalent to at least a 9mm out of a handgun. Very accurate, at least comparatively speaking. Can definitely work at some pretty decent ranges. You can do 100 yards with this thing easily. It's certainly not going to compete with a full-powered rifle, of course, but for something this small and light, it punches above its weight real well. But the problem is that the craftsmanship on it is just such that it's not overly durable. Like I said, the guide rail on it got bent, and while it didn't cause a malfunction, it definitely made me a little bit nervous. And so after that happened, I said, you know what, I really need to bring something that is going to hold up better under stress. Because when I'm traveling, frankly, I'm not overly nice on my suitcase, and traveling is just not nice on things in general. And so something that's kind of delicate, like I said, after I got the magazine issues figured out, the gun has actually been perfectly reliable from that point. I haven't had any malfunctions once I got the magazine issue figured out. But there are occasionally things that go wrong with it, and that's just because it's not the highest quality gun in the world, like having the guide rail bend on me. It happens when you have a gun that is made out of relatively cheap parts. and it is made out of relatively cheap parts, and it is a little on the flimsy side. So, great recreational gun, and if need be, you can press it into self-defense, but I just didn't feel overly comfortable with it. I wanted something that would be a little bit more durable and stand up to hard use a little bit better. So after that, I found another gun that would still fit in that same case, that would fit in the suitcase, and that was this beastie right here. This is a CZ Scorpion Evo 3 S1. And this gun wound up fitting into that case in the suitcase because it folds at the stock. And because it folds in the stock, I could actually put it in the case that would fit in the suitcase, in my bigger suitcase. And this is what I wound up using instead. This is, again, another 9mm gun. A lot of my guns are 9mm just because 9mm is a gun that fills 2 roles rather well. It's a gun that can be used recreationally because it's one of, if not the cheapest centerfire round that's out there. And while it's not super powerful, it can be used to defend yourself, and it is more powerful than a lot of the rimfire options like 22 or even 22 Magnum, at least when you're comparing same length barrels. Might not necessarily have the same range as a 22 Magnum, but in terms of muzzle energy, 9mm, if you're comparing things that in any way that's at all fair, and all same barrel length and those kinds of things, 9mm is better than that. So, not as good as a true rifle, but the fact that it can fold, which is something that a lot of true rifles can't do, or at least not very well, made this into a good option for me. And like I said, it's cheap to shoot because it shoots 9mm rounds, and 9mm rounds, at least for a long time there, were about half the cost of the 223 rounds that my AR-15 usually shoots. And so, relatively small package that could be stuffed in the suitcase fairly well, and then open it up and get a pretty good size package that you could really hold on target very accurately. And at the time I was running a little red dot on it. I'm not right now because this one is not the one that I'm using for that. But this gun, my CZ Scorpion carbine version with the long barrel on it, wound up being a really fantastic gun. Now this gun is a little bit heavy on my scale. It comes in at like 7 pounds 2 ounces. Like I said, I'm pretty sure that my scale is overestimating the weight. But it's 7 pounds 2 ounces, which is actually pretty close to a lot of AR-15 platforms. The difference though is that this one can fold down to a smaller package than most AR-15s can. You can get folding AR-15s, this is true, but that's usually extra expense, and when you do that with an AR-15, when you make it so that the stock folds over, you're actually opening up the guts of the gun when you do that, and you create ingress points for dirt and debris and dust bunnies and other various things to get in there. And the system that you have to do that with will also require some modification to the buffer head tube system itself, and sometimes you have to change out the buffer weight and things like that to get it to run properly, and it's just generally not a good idea. You're going to lose reliability when you do that. And then a lot of the AR-15s that are super small and that you can fold up and like that, you chop down the barrel to such an extent that you lose a lot of the rifle advantage. Once you get shorter than about 10 inches in an AR-15, what you wind up with is basically a really powerful 22. It's still going to have some pretty good penetration capabilities and whatnot, but you're not going to have the true rifle effect anymore once you get below 10 inches for the barrel length. And so, can you get an AR-15 that's going to, pack down to the same size? Yeah, you can. But is it going to be as reliable? A lot of times not, at least not without some doing. And you also will definitely be losing power. So you have a more expensive cartridge, and you're cutting down the power of that cartridge. It'll still beat a 9mm in most cases easily. But for what the round is capable of, you're really cutting its legs once you go under 10 inches, and there's all kinds of issues that way. But this one is legal as a rifle. Has a 16-inch barrel on it, and it's overall configured length is definitely more than 26 inches. Now this is an older design, and the ATF changed some of their definitions. It used to be the case, and this one's grandfathered in, but it used to be the case that if the method in which it was meant to be shot was over 26 inches overall length, that counted towards that 26 inches overall length that it needed to have. The ATF, though, recently changed that, and they said that the 26 inches has to be functional length, not shooting length, meaning that if the gun can function any shorter, then that's what counts as length. So now what the ATF says is that for these kinds of guns, you need to measure the length with basically the stock folded in, because the stock isn't actually necessary to get the gun to fire. It might be if you're actually going to get an accurate shot down range, but in order for the gun to function, you don't technically need the stock in order to get it to run. That might not be how you intend to use it, but how it functions is like that. And so new guns like this one, or even the CMR-30 that I showed, aren't going to happen. These ones have been grandfathered in. They've already been approved by the ATF. But any new guns, either that you would make yourself or that are going to be submitted from here on out, have to have an overall length, overall functional length of 26 inches, and overall using length of 26 inches doesn't count anymore. Okay. This gun is over 26 inches long with the stock out. But with it folded, it comes in a little bit under, what is it? 24 5/8 of an inch with the stock folded. And so by the new definition, this one would get in. Now, like I said, this one's grandfathered in because it's already been approved and it's on the market and things like that. But new guns that are like this are just not going to show up on the market anymore, unfortunately. Back to usage. When I originally got this gun, I got it as a plinking gun because, like I said, 9mm is cheap to plink. I wasn't actually thinking of using it as my bedside gun, but I discovered that it will actually fit in the case that my CMR-30 could fit in. This gun could fit in the same case. So I was like, well, might as well put in something that's more robust and more powerful and deal with that. And this thing has been phenomenal. I have not had a single malfunction out of this gun, and it is a very recreational, fun gun. And it's also not a bad gun around a hotel room. The fact that it is definitely on the longer side doesn't make it as maneuverable, that's true, but one nice thing about it is that I can, set it down and lean it up against something like a table pretty easily, because it's almost always longer than the table is, so it makes it pretty easy to set against something without doing any kind of thing. And the handguard is polymer, and so if I lean that up against something, it's not going to scratch something like metal would. And so as a around the hotel room kind of gun, it actually worked out really well. And then disaster struck. My old suitcase, my big gargantuan one, broke. And then also the airline that my company used whenever we would do flying, they changed their requirements on suitcase size. So my old suitcase broke, and on top of that, I had to get a different kind of suitcase anyways because the airline changed their requirements. So I wound up with a smaller suitcase, which means that this thing, even folded up, no longer fit in my suitcase. At least in the lockable case in the suitcase like I wanted. Shoo! I had to look at other options. And at the time, I was a little bit strapped for cash. Not bad. Certainly not like I am now where I'm laid off. But a little bit strapped for cash. And so I was looking for cheap alternatives. I really liked that gun, the CZ Scorpion. But I wanted something smaller and, frankly, something that wasn't as expensive. And what I came up with was this. This is the Grand Power Stribog SP9A1, and this is the version with the dual recoil rods. For those of you who know about that, there's some different versions out there and different reliabilities. This is the one with the dual recoil rods. And this one actually wound up being relatively economical. And as you can see, it's considerably smaller. Smaller than anything else that we've dealt with so far, and that's because this is actually an entirely different class of gun. This is, legally speaking, a pistol. You might look at it and say, that's a weird looking pistol, and you're right. but laws in America are strange. If you have something that has either a shorter barrel than 16 inches or a shorter overall length than the 26 inches, now that is considered a pistol as long as you don't have two things. If it's going to be small like that, it can't have a vertical foregrip. And you've seen on all these guns where I like to put a vertical foregrip on the end. This one does not have a vertical foregrip. It has the magazine, of course, but it doesn't have a vertical foregrip. If it's small like that and you don't want it to become a legal issue, it can't have a vertical foregrip, which this one doesn't have, and it also can't have a stock. Now that doesn't mean you can't put anything on the end. You'll see something on the end here. That's not a stock. This is what is called a brace. And the idea is that you can separate the two halves of the back end and stick your arm through there and grab a hold of it with it attached around your arm. And the end of this thing is actually flexible so that it can go around your arm, and that way you have the gun braced onto your arm. Now, the ATF has said, they may change their minds, they do that from time to time, but the ATF has said that if you take a brace, something that is designed to have your arm go through it, and you shoulder it, that is actually okay to do occasionally. The big differentiation for them is what is the device designed to be. And this device was very clearly designed to be a brace. It obviously has parts that you can separate, that you can stick your arm through, and it has a strap to hold your arm onto the gun. So this is very clearly designed to be a brace. And so if I happen to shoulder it once in a while, I'm not changing the design. It still is what it is, exactly as it came in the box. Okay, I'm not taking the strap off. I'm not making it rigid or anything like that. I'm leaving it as designed. That is perfectly okay, at least as far as the ATF is concerned right now. So, if need be, in a dire situation, I could actually shoulder this thing, get that third point of contact, and get accurate shots off. And the nice thing about this brace is that it does fold. And so I get a very small package. Let me see if I can check the length here. The Stribog folded up is just 16 inches and 7/8 of an inch. So just a little under 17 inches long in this configuration. Now this is a little bit different from some of them. You'll see I actually have a little bit of a riser in here that pushes the brace out just a little bit further to actually make it catch on the big part of my arm instead of the small part. So that changes things a little bit. If I didn't have that riser in there, it'd be a little bit shorter. But still, that's a really small package, and it fits in the new suitcase just fine. Very, very, very compact. And of course, when you travel with a gun in its travel configuration, you don't load it anyway. So very small package. That works just fine. Now, of course, you're going to need rounds there for when you get to the motel, of course, but you don't travel with it in the gun generally. Unless you're in a place, well, there's all kinds of different legalities in different places. I shouldn't say what is absolutely true. For me, traveling from state to state to state, and different states having different regulations, the best policy in most states is to have the gun unloaded in an unlocked container. That's the best policies for traveling. Now, in some states, even that won't be very good, especially depending on the gun that you're transporting. You know, New York, New Jersey, places like that, they're not gun friendly. Even doing that will not help you there. But in a lot of other states, having the gun unloaded and in a locked container is, and especially if the container is not immediately accessible to the driver, so and buried somewhere in the car, in the trunk, something like that, tucked away in a suitcase, in a case, inside of a suitcase, those kinds of things definitely increase what you can do legally and where you can go legally. But this fits in the new suitcase. It fit in the new case that goes in the suitcase, and so I was pretty happy with it. And generally speaking, it's not a bad gun, but it did start developing some problems. Like I said, I got this gun fairly cheap compared to the CZ Scorpion. This usually comes in, you know, $100, $200 less than a CZ Scorpion, and unfortunately it has some quality issues. It's kind of the the same thing that I ran into with the CMR-30. CMR-30 is a really cool concept, a very lightweight gun. For its weight, pretty powerful for its weight, but cool concept, good shooter, all those kinds of things. But the quality just isn't really there. And the Stribog is kind of like that. It's not nearly as bad, but there are some issues that developed. One issue that developed is that the magazine feed lips started to crack a little bit. I got some hairline fractures in there. And of course, if your feed lips go bad on your magazine, then it's not going to be able to feed rounds properly, which means the gun isn't going to work properly, and that's definitely a bad thing. Another issue that I had with this gun is that sometimes it wouldn't feed rounds under what are called bump fire conditions. Bump fire is, you can do it with a lot of guns, Stribog included. It's where you basically pull forward on the gun. You don't have the back of the gun braced up against anything, it's just left loose. You pull forward on the gun, and the motion of pulling forward on the gun is what actually pulls the trigger. You just basically kind of hold your trigger finger there, yank forward on the gun, that'll set the gun off, it'll recoil and allow the trigger to reset, but you're still applying a pressure with your other hand, and so it brings it back again, and you can get the gun to fire pretty quickly that way. Not quite as fast as a lot of true machine guns can go, but still pretty fast. And it's a lot of fun to do. It's not very accurate, but it's a lot of fun. But under those conditions, this gun will have malfunctions. And that's not a huge thing, because in a defensive encounter, you're probably not going to be bump firing because you actually want to hit the target. Bump fire is not very accurate at all. So probably not going to be doing that in a defensive situation, but it still bothered me that I could get it to malfunction pretty much on cue. Just bump fire with it and watch what happens. It's not pretty, it's not good. Yeah, definitely did not produce any great confidence in me. It's not as bad as the CMR-30, and you know, like I said, under normal operating conditions, it's not an issue. And even though the magazine lips have started to crack, they haven't actually failed yet. But I'm certainly not overly impressed with the magazine quality. They're not great, at least as they stand right now. And like I said, under bump fire conditions, I can get it to malfunction, and I don't like it when I can get the gun to malfunction on cue. And so, once I got into a better spot financially, I decided, you know what, trading up to something that's a little bit more reliable would probably be a good idea. And that's where I wound up with my current bedside gun. And that is the pistol version of the CZ Scorpion. The CZ Scorpion is the one that, when I had the big suitcase, I used to like. This is the CZ Scorpion Carbine. And like I said, never had a malfunction with that gun. Super reliable. Still fun. It has a heavy trigger on it, and there's some ergonomic issues with them. But what I like about them is just how reliable they are. And this thing has been similar, but not quite the same as the carbine. Like I said, with the carbine, I've never had an issue. This one I did get to take out this weekend, and I did have a couple of issues with it. I had a couple of stovepipes on the first magazine. Now, I wasn't able to reproduce that problem, though, from the future going on, so I think it was just a break-in issue, which is different from the one that it's replacing, the Stribog, because this one, like I said, I could basically get it to malfunction on cue. It wasn't a problem that showed up at one time and then went away and worked itself out. No, it's there, and it's always has been there, and it's still there, and the issue with the magazines is still there. But the CZ Scorpion line hasn't had magazine issues in a while. When they first came on the market, they did. But now there's so many aftermarket manufacturers of magazines and whatnot, and you can get ones with steel reinforced lips and all these things. It's really not an issue anymore. Stay away from the first generation factory magazines, stay away from the Manticore magazines, and you won't have magazine issues, basically. That's the way it winds up being for most people. And then, like I said, the two stovepipes that happened when I was firing over the weekend certainly were not pleasant, but I could not reproduce that. It happened on the first magazine through the gun, and I could not get it to do it again. And believe me, I tried. I put a lot of rounds through it over the weekend. probably somewhere between 150 and 200 rounds at least, which isn't, okay, granted that's not a ton, but it's still a good number of rounds and give you a good number of things, and I put a lot of different kinds of rounds through it. 115 and 124 grain and 80 grain, because some of my defensive rounds are 80 grain, and so I want to make sure that it could work with those. And I also used a variety of manufacturers. One used Fort Scott, used Winchester, I used Spear, I used Remington. Can't remember if I did any Federal or not. I don't think I did. But still, number of different manufacturers, number of different bullet weights, and I could not get it to do it again. And so I'm pretty confident that it's whatever it was has worked itself out. And so I'm not overly worried. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on it, of course, but so far it hasn't been a big issue. And like I said, my biggest thing is that I can't get it to do that on again, unlike the Stribog, and so that makes me pretty happy. And so, yeah, Stribog has kind of a chintzy magazine, and I can get it to malfunction on command. The CZ Scorpion that's replacing it, it did have 2 malfunctions on the first magazine. I haven't been able to replicate the error at all, and the magazine quality on these things has gone up considerably from when they first came out, such that cracked feed lips and those kinds of things are basically a thing of the past. And so CZ Scorpion, I definitely like it more. Now this doesn't mean that the Stribog is necessarily a bad gun. There are some things I don't like about it. I'm not a huge fan of the ergonomics on it. They're very AR-15-ish, and I'm just not a big AR-15 guy, but they're not bad. They're very workable. I don't like that it's a forward-heavy gun. It has a telescoping bolts, and I've talked about that in other videos on the Stribog, and that makes it pretty forward-heavy despite its size. Not that it's overall a heavy gun. These two are actually, for all intents and purposes, the same weight. And if I line them up properly here, you can see that the links are also virtually identical as well. So they're pretty much the same weight, and they're pretty much the same size. The difference is just where the quality level is right now. The Stribog doesn't have the highest quality in terms of the magazines, and like I said, I can get it to malfunction on command when I bump fire. I don't like that. The CZ Scorpion, obviously they're not immune to malfunctions of any kind, because I had a couple with this one, but they're usually just break-in problems, and the magazines are now great. And one of the things I really love about it is the balance. This one does not have a telescoping bolt in it, which makes the gun kind of chunky. It makes it kind of thick by comparison. Okay, so the Stribog, very svelte. CZ Scorpion is kind of chunky, and a lot of that has to do with the shape of the bolt. So it is kind of a chunky gun, but personally to me that makes it a little easier to handle, feels a little bit fuller in the hand. But another advantage of having the bolt more towards the rear than in the Stribog is that the center of balance is more towards the rear, so it's a very easy gun to one hand. In terms of weight, both of these guns come in at about 6 pounds. The Stribog is slightly heavier, by no more than 6 ounces, and that really depends on how you have it configured. For the Stribog, they do make a brace that's very similar to this one that I have on the Scorpion, and it weighs a little bit less than the configuration that it has right now, and if you did that, they'd probably be pretty close to the same. The Stribog would still be just a little bit heavier by like 2 to 4 ounces maybe, but for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much the same weight. The difference, though, is in the center of balance. Stribog is front heavy, the CZ Scorpion here is very back heavy, which I like. It just makes it so much easier to one-hand this thing. Not that you need to, but it's nice to be able to. And like I said, the overall reliability of CZ Scorpions tends to be better. Yes, evidently you do get a malfunction here and there, but so far in my experience, it's either the case that you won't have any malfunctions whatsoever, like I did with the carbine, or you might have a malfunction or two when you're first using the gun, but after that it should break in quite nicely. And that has been my experience. And to be fair, on top of that, the magazines that I was using when I had that malfunction was an aftermarket mag, a third-party magazine. I've never had issues with factory magazines in either one of these guns, so that might be part of the issue as well. I don't know. But yeah, that's where I am right now, enjoying the traveling gun life. Now, is this what I would consider to be the best bedside gun for everyone? Obviously not. Like I said, a lot of people who have problems with handguns, which would be most people, you're going to be better served by some kind of a long gun. And if you're going to get a long gun, you might as well get something with some power to it. An AR-15, pump action shotgun, something like that. It's going to serve a lot of people a lot better than something like this. But if you're in a situation like I am, where you want a gun that can perform recreationally, that you can shoot it pretty cheaply, 9mm you can shoot pretty cheaply. And if you want something that can travel well, something that folds up into a very small little package is very nice. It's not what is best for everyone, but it is something that will work for particular people. A lot of people who are going to watch this video, though, are probably more interested in these things recreationally, and frankly, recreationally, all of these things are a hoot. In terms of the one that is probably the most fun, once you've got it running right, that is, the one that's the most fun to just go out and plink with, to me, is the CMR-30. It is a gun that has a good bit of range on it for what it is, for its size. Very lightweight, pretty accurate, nice light trigger, and you have 30 rounds of 22 Magnum on tap. That is a lot of fun. Like I said, it is kind of a finicky gun. To get it to run at first, you're going to have to probably manipulate the magazines a bit. And then after you manipulate the magazines a bit, you could have other issues down the road just because it's not a super high quality gun. And so for really serious use, probably not what you want to go with, but for recreation, fun gun. Very smooth shooter too. It's a blowback design, but it's a telescoping bolt, and so it tends to be pretty smooth. You do have to be careful about what kind of ammunition that you put in it. It needs to be fairly heavy stuff. The CCI Maximag is usually what runs best. Sometimes you can get other brands to do okay, but CCI Maximag is usually what does best in that gun, and it's kind of designed around that. As far as next best to shoot after that, recreationally, my Tavor X95 is actually probably going to be my number 2, in that it's heavy, which means it's not fun to pack around everywhere, but that added weight really does absorb a lot of recoil, and it makes it a lot more pleasant to shoot. And this thing also groups pretty well, at least for a pistol caliber carbine, and very regularly built. And like I said, the only malfunctions that I've had with it were basically user caused, using the wrong oil or resting on the magazine when you shouldn't. And that's true for a lot of guns. A lot of guns, if you rest on the magazine, you're going to have issues. But other than that, it is a little beast of a gun. And like I said, the added weight really does absorb a lot of recoil and helps you kind of hang on target real well. And so it really is a pretty accurate and fun gun. And kind of my first serious gun, and so that kind of has a special place for me. Next in terms of fun has to be the original, the MP1522. Shoots 22 LR. It's really cheap to shoot, it's very lightweight, it's easy to hold on target. For recreational purposes, it's hard to beat a good 22. And the nice thing about this 22 is that it looks like an AR-15. It has AR-15 ergos, and so you kind of feel like you're doing more than you actually are. But you do it without breaking the bank, and it still looks cool, and it's still fun, and all those kinds of things. So recreational, that is definitely a good one. Next, in terms of recreation, I'd really have a hard time choosing. I think that the next one down the list is going to be the full-size ZZ Scorpion carbine. Honestly, CZ Scorpions have a little bit of recoil to them that a lot of other guns of the same kind, pistol caliber carbine-ish type guns, Don't have it. It recoils pretty hard and also has a pretty heavy trigger out of the factory. And I've talked about that before. I don't necessarily mind that, but in terms of recreational shooting, not overly pleasant. But it's still not bad. Can still hold decent groups with it. It's still a whole lot of fun. And like I said, this particular one has been perfectly reliable for me. It's definitely coming up on thousands of rounds now, and not a single hiccup. It just runs and runs and runs and runs, and having a gun that you don't ever have to worry about it going down on you is really enjoyable. And it meets the full definition of being a legal rifle. It's been grandfathered in, and the modern definition is a little different. But at the time, it met the full definition of a legal rifle, and therefore, being grandfathered in, it still does. And so, legally, it's a very, very safe gun. The ATF is not likely going to change anything that would affect that. At least not in the immediately near future. Who knows what the coronavirus stuff will do. And then, after that, next most fun to shoot is going to be the new CZ Scorpion. Now, as time goes on, this will probably climb up in the list quite a bit, just as I get used to it. But the fact that I had those two stovepipes on the first magazine is still playing in the back of my mind, and I'd like to get more rounds on it before I give it a full, clean bill of health. It looks good. Like I said, I haven't been able to repeat the problem, but like I said, that's only 150 to 200 rounds. I feel a lot more comfortable once I get past 500 rounds. If I can get through 500 rounds without any new malfunctions, then I know it's pretty good. And that's just going to be an issue of track record. But in terms of just good old shooting fun, something that's this small and very lightweight, because like I said, it comes in at just about 6 pounds and back heavy, so it's very easy to manipulate. It's just a really fun gun to shoot, and I just absolutely love this little thing. Really, really do. And then, of course, that means that second to last, not quite last, second to last is going to be the Stribog. Doesn't mean that it's a bad design, and I think that Stribog could do a lot of things to it that would really make this thing a true contender. I actually have a lot of high hopes for it. It's just this particular one. Like I said, I can get it to malfunction on cue, which isn't good, and I'm definitely not confident about those magazines, especially those feed libs. And so that just always kind of nags me in the back of my mind. As long as it's running good, basically if I'm not bump firing it and I'm not, and the magazines are still in good condition when I take them out to the range, it actually is a lot of fun to shoot. It is a small and cool gun. But the mechanical issues that I have with it, and I still have with it, just to kind of detract from some of that fun. And then the gun that is least fun for me to shoot that's here is the AR-15. And that's mostly an issue of balance, because it's very forward heavy. It has a heavy profile barrel in it, so it's going to be front heavy. The scope definitely does not help with it being front heavy either, and I don't like front heavy guns. I've mentioned that in other videos, I just don't. But one of the bigger issues that I have with it is just the cost. If you're sticking with factory ammunition, you know, oftentimes it's double the cost of what it is shooting most of these other rounds, or at least 50% more than the cost of shooting any of these other guns. And so recreationally, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and that fact that, you know, that's money going down range every time you pull the trigger is always playing in the back of my mind. You know, I really wish that this was a cheaper round. It's not that it isn't cool, it's not that it, you know, having the extended range of a true rifle isn't nice, but the fact that it's expensive and the fact that it doesn't balance like I would want it to balance, you know, it just makes it not as enjoyable for me. Other people are very different. Other people absolutely love AR-15 platform, got used to the AR-15 platform at a very early stage, and they just love running the thing. And if that's you, cool. But for me, I like my guns to be cheaper. To shoot, I also like the balance to be further back. And of course, in the context of a bedside gun, whereas I've traveled a lot, like I said, I've been laid off now, so who knows what the future will hold as far as jobs and what I do for a job. But Up until this point, I've been traveling a lot, and so having something that traveled better made sense, and practicing with the gun that you actually have with you most often makes more sense. So yeah, not really my thing to go for the AR-15 or the pump shotgun, but for a lot of other people, a lot of general people who don't travel nearly as much as I do, I think those guns are actually probably going to be the big winners out there in terms of what is going to give them the best bang for their buck. But hopefully you guys got to see some cool guns and listen to me ramble about them, and hopefully you enjoyed it. And if not, well, we're only stuck with each other until the end of the quarantine.